All right, friends and family, welcome back. Great episode of Dr. J Radio Live on the very sad 18-year anniversary of. I'm going to get in trouble for time, which is why we're starting an hour earlier. Almost, 20 minutes late, but that's on purpose. More people be in the chat. Plus, me and my guest were, talking a few things about the show for a few minutes that we feel is necessary that we talk about during this time because a lot has happened since she's been back, since she was on last year, and made waves at that. What she has said, literally, that interview went viral, and the average listening time duration for that video was the entire 2 hours. And now you can't even talk about 9/11 without being demonetized, let alone having an entire debate or argument or showing proof. Yes, folks, proof of some fuckery going on. Serious fuckery. Now, I'm going to tell you this as I introduce my guest, and I repeated this last year, but at any time that we're getting too much to covering exactly what we talked about last year, we're just going to reference to say go back and listen to the other interview because there's so much information with her. I can go I can book her every day and we could talk about this. And I promise you, after months of doing this, we still have more. This is exactly why she has her own show. And she has members that are constantly bringing new information and evidence to be looked at. And there are thousands of people involved in this. So, where was I? September 11th, 2001. Well, I was 21 years old, going on 22. I was beginning my semester at UCSB after getting my associate's degree from College of the Canyons and moved from San Fernando Valley in Southern California from Northridge to Santa Barbara. I was still producing concerts, raves, whatever you want to at that time, and I had just come back from a Vegas show that we had done. And so I figured instead of going back to my apartment, that which was a week, it was a holiday weekend. I believe it was. If it wasn't, then I just happened to be off on that Monday. So I stayed at my family's home on that Monday and Tuesday planning to go up to Santa Barbara. I remember getting woken up, and I'll never forget these words. This is coming from an immigrant woman from Greece who, like me, English is the second language, but she learned English far later in life than me learning it when I was 4. And she opened the door, turned on my TV, and I'm just confused, like I'm, being woken up really early. Knows I have a hangover. She knows I just came back from Vegas. And she said, "Look what is happening in the United States today." And I just see one of the two towers, on fire. And as I'm like trying to get a hold of what's a grasp of what's happening, the second building hits. And then the rest is history of what happened. The collapse hours ago. So I went downstairs to where my mother was watching, I believe, CNN and ABC, or she kept going back and forth, but those were the two channels. And both of them, as I walked down, basically talking as I'm getting down the stairs, saying, "What the Solomon building just went down. Solomon Brothers building just went down." And as I reach the final step, and I turn and look into the living room TV, I see a different sight than what I have upstairs. There is a new tower that is gone, just gone. It's not erupting in front of me. It's not collapsing right in front of me. You don't see a bunch of smoke from, it just collapsing a moment ago, but it was gone like it had happened several minutes ago. Confused, I went back upstairs. BBC, same shit. It hasn't happened yet. The same thing as I watched before I went downstairs. Then I'm really confused, and I go back and forth, and then finally, about 20 minutes. Some people have even come to, I think it's 18 minutes. I remember it's about 20 minutes later that, in fact, there was another building, which was Tower 7, which they called the Solomon Brothers building collapse, and that was the start of so many questions. And here we are, 18 years later, a full generation. People who were born on 9/11 2001 are eligible to vote today. It's been that long, folks, yet here we are, still talking about it with super great interest. Now, the guest who I've given you enough time to check out her her show from the past, her all her work, who she's constantly working on this topic, her books, etc., that you could find by clicking her name in my website. I hope I've given you enough time so you could finally know who I'm talking about. If not, let me introduce back to you the one and only Miss Rebekah Roth. Rebekah, welcome back.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Now,
I can't believe it's been a year either.
I know, I know. I honestly, I thought I would have done something with you maybe halfway through the years. I just did not expect it. I'm like, oh my God, it's like early August. I'm like, I, I have to book Rebekah before it's too late for 9/11. I have to. So, anyhow, I'm glad it all worked out. Now, you've heard me say the same thing last year of my BBC story. I was just blown away. Can you tell us on 9/11 what were you doing?
I can tell you exactly what I was doing. It's kind of like the day that now I'm old enough to remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And so at my age, you can say, where were you when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? It's just like 9/11. Where were you when the towers fell? I was actually home. I had just gotten home from working a trip as an international purser, and I had just gotten home from Europe. And I got a phone call, and someone just said, turn on your television," and just hung up. I turned on the television just in time to see what appeared to be an airplane hitting into the South Tower. The North Tower was already smoking. And I actually thought initially that whoever picked up, whoever called me was somehow figured out a way to hijack my TV, or there was some kind of new version of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds kind of. I just thought it was a fake trick photography or some kind of new, up-to-date War of the Worlds kind of thing where they were pretending this. Because over the years of being a flight attendant, we have a yearly training. And in that training, we discuss every kind of airplane incident, whether it was a crash where they crashed into a building or went off the runway and went into a fence or, crashed into a mountain.
You're talking about every year the what? So every time there's a crash of, say, a passenger jet, right? The NTSB steps in to investigate, and every year, sadly, things happen. So you're saying each year in your training, did you focus on those kind of planes, passenger jets?
Everything that had happened the year or two before. In some years, there isn't any airplane incidences or accidents like that. So you'll review the latest things that have happened the year before. Every year, every flight attendant is assigned in training. When you get your wings, you're given a month where you have your yearly training. And so every month of your training, every year, you have to go through, finish a workbook at home or when you're on your overnight, at work, on your layovers. And then you've got so many hours that they put into finishing a workbook where you have to go through and review all of the emergency equipment on every kind of aircraft you fly. And then we have NTSB, FAA, various people from various government agencies talk about, if there was a hijacking, even if it was in Europe, sometimes we would get information about that. We'd go through our hijack protocol, our first aid stuff, how to use the defibrillator when those came on board, and that sort of thing. But we discussed if an airplane, like let's just say Japan Airlines had a crash one year, it was a 747 into a mountain. And so we would go through and see slides, videos, of what was left of the airplane. What happened? How did it happen? Did anybody survive? Each crash like that over the years. And so I had seen aluminum airplanes been hit by birds. I had seen airplanes really wiped out by hailstorms. I'd seen lots of different crashes, but I'd never seen one fly all the way through a building and leave like a powder puff of smoke as it entered in, as we continue to see with that supposed United 175. I was like, how did they do that?
That's the 175 is the first one, right?
That was the second plane that hit the South Tower. Nobody really saw the first one until several days later, the Naudet brothers.
Yeah, the French ones that were doing the documentary in the LAFD.
Mm-hmm.
Naudet
and
brothers.
So they were, the Naudet brothers, they were visiting New York doing a documentary. So nobody really saw the first one, which is why people went, wait a minute, because you'll remember President Bush was at that grade school. And he came out and said publicly, I saw the first airplane.
Which is bullshit, because how could he see it?
Exactly. Well, there's a lot more bullshit than that in the whole 9/11 thing. I never have been involved with conspiracy theories. I always thought that Kennedy was assassinated. Even since I was a kid, and I was like a young teenager. So I heard people mention military-industrial complex, and it wasn't until I really got into studying 9/11 that I understood the ramifications of who those people are and what they're capable of and who their army is. So I never really looked at 9/11 as a conspiracy. I thought, I don't know how they did it, but it just changed my world for sure. So I actually started to write a book in my retirement, and I can't even remember. I think it was around 2008 or so. And I thought, just for fun, I'm going to write a book for girls to read that wanted to travel and be a flight attendant, because a lot of girls always wanted to do that. And I went to pull a name of a character I wanted to bring into this book, a Middle Eastern name, and I just Google searched or did some kind of, I hate to say the word Google now because they've got me censored so badly.
Yeah, they do.
It's a internet search. I'll say, I hate to say the G word, but I found a BBC article dated, I think it was September 23rd, 2001, where all of these guys that were accused of being hijackers on board were still alive and had never been to the United States. And a few of them were actually professional airline pilots. And I was like, well, how did I miss this? Well, how come they didn't tell us this in training? But what was another interesting thing about airline training, and I've talked to numerous flight attendants from very many different airlines that had the same experience. In our yearly recurrent training, you could not ask a question about 9/11. How did it happen? How did they get into the cockpit? None of those questions were allowed. You were just shunned, just like you are on YouTube if you talk about 9/11. So I found that was kind of interesting, and it kind of got me suspicious, but I just have never been into conspiracy. So but when I found those guys were still alive, I thought, wait a minute, what really happened? And I started really looking and pulling information. I found so much information. Now, this was after the 9/11 Commission. It was after the 20th hijacker they called Zachariah Moussaoui, his trial. So there was lots of stuff online. I started pulling FBI 302s. And I found Betty.
For those who don't know, are FICE applications, Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, right?
Oh, they are not. They are the initial FBI interview notes.
I see.
And they cannot legally be changed. And this is what happened to me. I found a couple for Betty Ong, and I printed them out and stapled them together. And then I was reading one with a highlighter, and here's what I found. The second one had been changed, and the first one had said things like, he stood upstairs, we're the first, and this was Flight 11, they were the first hijacked plane that day. But she also said things that didn't make any sense, like, and these were removed. These were details that were either changed or completely removed. And I thought, well, how would she know they're the first? Why would she say we're the first? He stood upstairs. She also said, he has pepper spray or mace. That was left in. But these other he stood upstairs, was removed from their 302s. I actually didn't know that it was illegal for the FBI to change a 302 until this Donald Trump Russia gate that's going on, the coup that is still actively going on. I didn't know they couldn't change them, but I found at least 2 different 302s for Betty Ong. And then I did see, well, wait a minute. There are no stairs 67. So why would she say he stood upstairs? And I realized there's stairs in a hangar. Then she said, we're the first. And I thought that's impossible unless somebody told her there were going to be 4 or more hijackings. Somebody had to have told her the plan. And then she said this. She said he, as in one hijacker, as only one. And both the flight attendants that called in referred to only one, not 5, not they, not bad guys, not more than one, just a he. She said that he sprayed pepper spray or mace in first class or business class up front by the cockpit. We can't breathe up there. She's sitting in door 3 right, which is the aft jump seat on the right side. She's on the phone for nearly a half an hour. And I'll tell you why that's crazy too. And she never complained about the pepper spray or mace. And I realized right then and there that they were no longer pressurized. They had to have been on the ground. Also, then I found out that at 3 right, the jump seat, there was no airphone, which now means she had to be on a cell phone because there was no airphone for us. That's where we sit to help you get off the airplane, and we sit on our hands for takeoff and landing. You can't be on a phone. So there was no phone located by 3 right on the 767 of American Airlines. So then I started to think, oh, wow, this is really weird. And then I started to see that the other flight attendant that called, well, first off, Betty called reservations, and she did something else that was really bizarre. Anytime any flight attendant, pilot, ground personnel, reservation agent calls to the company, certainly to reservations, you would give your name and then your employee number. My name is, hi, this is so-and-so. This is Rebekah Roth. My employee number is 876592. That's the way you talk to the company. And she never gave her a number, never gave her employee number. Now, everything is attached to your employee number, your flight schedule, where you are at that very moment.
It's like your social security number for the industry, but it gives you everything they need to know.
Including your next of kin to be notified if you don't make it through this.
Something happens, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So you just don't ever say it's standard. It's just like giving your name. And she didn't do that. And neither did Amy Sweeney, the other flight attendant. But reservations you're almost always on hold. So if you call an 800 number, you're almost always on hold 10 minutes. It's not the number you would call to get immediate help, which I found really being a passenger seat so you don't look like another flight attendant dealing with. None of the crew members did that. None of them crew members on all 4 flights followed the FAA set in stone protocol to get help immediately and to go through a hijacking successfully. Not one of them. And so this was bothering me tremendously. When Amy Sweeney called, she said some other crazy stuff. She called her supervisor. Both Amy Sweeney and Betty Ong from Flight 11 gave the wrong flight number. They were on Flight 11. They both, at some point in their call, referenced that they were on Flight 12 in their inbound flight the next day back into Boston. Mm-hmm. That caused a great deal of confusion, and much like everything else that happened that day, slowed down the response of the military, slowed down the response of the FAA, slowed down everything, and confused everyone. So, but she called her a supervisor, supposedly from his cell phone, and she called several times, but she said that several things that were really bizarre. She said she was sitting in the last row, second to the last row coach, which kind of is following protocol. But she also said Betty Ong was sitting next to her. But Betty Ong said at least 4 or 5 times, maybe 6, that she was seated at her jump seat in 3 right. Well, sitting in your uniform in your jump seat on a phone breaks all protocol. Because if there really was a real hijacker on board, you would be dead. And they would find you. Trust me. That was the craziest thing that she did. She should have sat down in one of the nearly 100 empty passenger seats.
Yeah, you would think, right? It wasn't a flight full. None of the flights were full that day.
Exactly. And there's reason for that too. But it's beyond coincidence at this point. But Amy Sweeney says, and now she's about 30 to 40 minutes into the flight. It's a transcontinental 6+ hour flight from Boston to California. She says to her boss, well, the coach passengers, they have no idea anything's wrong. But that in reality, let me tell you this, if you haven't ever flown an early morning breakfast flight like this one was, much like the story of all the crew members, you leave your home around 4 a.m., you drive for your 1 hour, 45 minutes to the airport, you park in some parking lot, then you have to get on some sort of car rental or some sort of employee bus and take a bus into the terminal. Then you got to go through security, and then you got to go through the office for us to check in, and you have to do that before an hour before departure. So most everybody gets up for a 7:45, 7:30 scheduled departure, which that one was, pretty darn early in the morning. So when you've got a flight like that, what we do, and at that time in 2001, we actually served hot breakfasts on transcontinental flights. And also there was a lot of competition. So 15 after takeoff, we were to be in the aisles serving. But on that day, apparently nobody was serving, and the passengers didn't think anything of it. So 40 minutes into the flight, you're probably sitting there thinking, damn, do I need a cup of coffee? Where the hell are the flight attendants? So you would walk back to the back galley. And then you would sit and see Amy Sweeney on one aisle sitting on the phone in a passenger seat, and then Betty Ong sitting in a jump seat on a phone. You think, what the hell's going on here? Right? That's what really would have happened. So I started to see all these things from my own experience. It's like, wait a minute. You can't tell me that you're going to be up in the air for a half an hour, 40 minutes, and nobody knew there was something wrong. They would have marched right through that curtain and said, well, what's the deal with the crew in the back, right? So they started to see all these weird things and these different details coming. And one of the things we are taught to do in any kind of a planned emergency or any kind of an incident like this is to synchronize our phones and give the correct same information. What I started to see was all these different details between these two flight attendants. One was saying that there was a passenger stabbed up front, and that two of the row 10 and row 2 or something. She tells them that. But again, if you were successful in the air to make a phone call with your cell, it would have been short-lived. Both these girls only said there was one hijacker, not 5. They just said he, as in one guy. And so then I found out that this guy had been born and raised until he was 14 in Denver, Colorado, which, by the way, some of the ID that they used was stolen from Denver, Colorado. Coincidence? Again, I'm sure. He was fluent in English. He spoke perfect English without an accent, fluent in Hebrew and in Arabic. So if you were to believe the story that these two tiny Arabs, there were two very small non-English speaking Arabs that were planning, and he could have understood anything they said, to go to the cockpit, but on the way they were going to take this guy out because he looked like he could kill anybody with a pen and a credit card. Why would they have targeted this guy? This makes no sense at all. But coincidentally, there was another Jewish guy on Flight 93 that was supposedly killed too, but you don't hear much about him. This guy, Daniel Lewin, the family changed their last name to Lewis when they moved to Israel. This guy is a hero. He has a statues built in Israel for him because he's like their hero. But let me just say this, because there's some confusion apparently. What is a hero? Here's what a hero is. A hero, if you were a flight attendant, a hero would have followed all FAA hijack protocols, and we would have got that plane landed, and a hostage rescue team member and a team would have come through our doors and would have secured the passengers, the plane, and no one would have died. And that would have been what a hero does. A hero does not do stupid stuff like break all protocol and then have everybody killed. I'm sorry, that's just not what it is. But here's another interesting thing. Hiding away in this Freedom of Information Act data, and I came into almost a terabyte of data. Hiding away in there is an interesting thing where they claim this guy, Daniel Lewin, either shot or was shot. Somebody was shot, they say, with a gun. But the FAA tried to cover that up. Oh, no, we can't have that. Well, first off, it's very dangerous to shoot a gun in a pressurized airplane. You take the chances of breaking a window and having a catastrophic decompression. Then it's a real mess. So I'm thinking, well, this is really weird. They're saying this, but then the FAA really tried hard to deny that there's no gun. There was no gun. And then also one of the passengers on Flight 93 said there was a gun as well. But I thought, well, why are the FAA hiding this fact that there was a gun? So what? Well, if I told you there was a gun on Flight 11, the first thing you would probably ask me would be, how did they get a gun through security? Who was running security? Well, lo and behold, security was run by a company called ICTS, a company out of Israel. They have a subsidiary company that was running most of American, United, certainly was Boston. Huntley USA was a subsidiary, and they ran a lot of security at a lot of our airports. An Israeli company, parent company called ICTS. So I'm starting to see there's this pattern forming, and it has to do with Israelis. I thought, well, I went into this thinking it was 19 radical Muslims. So how does this work? So I found out a lot of different things as I started looking, and then I just started taking flight by flight.
But
and I found
real quick, let me say this because I heard this actually early on. I heard that Mossad was in New York City for several weeks leading up to the event, as well as I'm sure we'll get to this, but a lot of people were called that were executives in that building, specifically CEOs that were Jewish executives who were warned not to go in that day.
Yeah, that's true. It was called the Odigo message system, and it's from Israel. It's a text message service where they can send out information like that. Don't go to work. Don't go in the World Trade Center today.
Don't. So, what did we contract with Mossad to come out here? How did the Jewish people, get involved with that fateful false flag?
Well, it's interesting because they're involved in so many ways. Now, a lot of people don't realize this, but I think you're reading the second book, Methodical Deception.
I am. Right? That's right. And for all those out there, please get Rebekah's books. I don't vouch for many books to read. Every time Preston Dennett's on, I say, please get UFOs over California if you live in here. Please buy her books. She is on her 5th book, and after that, she's going to write it in nonfiction. Although this is written as a novel, though the first one that I had read, which is in my hands actually, and the second one's in the other room as I'm reading that, they will blow your fucking mind. I mean, you will struggle to put this book down as I have. And I tell you, there are several times I read multiple paragraphs twice or even the entire chapter twice because it was such a bombshell. The first one is Methodical Illusion. It's got a really cool jigsaw on it, and Rebekah, when near the end, will, I'll give her much time to plug on everything. But from me to you people, this isn't Dr. J speaking as a host. This is John Elias, just the straight, regular civilian researcher guy. I'm telling this to you guys and gals out there. Please read this. You will not find anything on 9/11 as comprehensive as what Rebekah Roth has written.
Well, thank you. So this Methodical Deception, and you guys can go to the website now if you're sitting on a computer listening. It's methodicaldeception.com. And if you go to that website, what I'm about to tell you, this is basically the 9/11 info on the book. Now, the books all go together. So they're in sequence. Illusion the first and Deception the second. And on this one, you'll find a page called The Artists. And this was just mind-blowing to me that there was a group of, again, Jewish Austrians living in the World Trade Center towers. The year leading up to 9/11, they were doing an art project for the Lower Manhattan Cultural Center. They actually have, there's a picture of it here, the Metro section of the New York Times dated August 18th, 2001, balcony seen or unseen atop the world. This group of artists, they did a book called The Bee Thing. They called themselves Gelatin. And they all had temporary construction passes. There's one of those also on this page. Just click on the main menu, The Artists, from methodicaldeception.com. There's a lot of information on this one because I found it was just fascinating. that nobody ever questioned. These artists, what they did was they took a window out. I think it was in the 96th floor. They took a window out and built a wooden balcony and stuck it out there. That's why they call it the bee thing. And there's pictures in there. There's a lot of details in here. And one of the things I discovered that these cardboard boxes behind a picture of these guys, one standing in the window, one's they've got repelling gear on, because if you open or break a window or pull a window out when you're that high, you can get sucked out. So these guys are kind of attached to the structure inside. But I started to find out that through long stories, but I'll make it short. Behind this one guy in this one photo is a box of BB-18, and those were fuse bars. And these are what could have been used for the remote control demolition of the towers. And there's boxes and boxes of them, and they're in several of the pictures. So you'll see the artists, you can see their artwork. So you can see they draw about the kindergarten level. So I want you to see that what kind of artists they are, or were actually, but they were living in the towers. So there's two stories in Methodical Deception that concern artists. There were the Austrian Jewish art group, the Gelatin group, that were living, I think it was the 91st or 96th floor, I can't remember for sure. And they were there. And they were selling Chinese prints they buy for $10 or so, to knocking on the door of an office or private homes from U.S. Marshals, IRS agents, DEA agents, any kind of federal agent. And they even sometimes had a blueprint of the structure of the office space they were in, and asking very suspicious questions. And actually, one of the people involved in the DEA report has become a very good friend of mine now. Because this is very interesting how this all came together. They started collecting. So you can click on there. You can actually read their names, where they were arrested, what their story was. It's all there. So I think it's 66 pages in a PDF. And so you can find that there also. There's a lot of information there about those two things. And so that was like the information for me that really, I kept the novel storyline going through Methodical Deception, using those things. And then as I went into book 3, by that time I had been joined by, this is very interesting, this one has a gold cover, a puzzle that's in gold with light coming through it. This guy was an air traffic controller for Edwards Air Force Base. He also was the military liaison to Area 51. He had some incredible stories, and they are in this book, Methodical Conclusion, the third book, and Methodical Exposure, just because they were just phenomenal. And there is a UFO. There is a story on the book 4 that some people are really upset about this lizard-type character, but it's a true story from Haystack Butte, just outside of Edwards Air Force Base. So people are really upset about this. I mean, why did you talk about an alien? Well, why not? It's true. It's real. It's there. It's a real story.
Thank you for saying that. You know what? I had a former Secret Service agent on, and he was talking about the same thing. He deviated from being on presidential detail, etc., and then went on to talk about, I'm sorry for that. Damn cold. He went on to talk about Bob Lazar at S4. Then he went off to talk about people like, Dan Burrish and J-Rod. And I was blown away. And I'm glad what you just said, your response was, you're talking about it because it's real.
It is. And so people just, see. Truth brings out some weird stuff in people. It's amazing. I have really gone deep into... For my 4th book, I really covered in depth the CIA and their history, because their history is repeating itself right now with an ongoing coup against our duly elected president. Whether you like him or not, we have a system in this country. We elected him. Whether you voted for him or not, you're going to go through 4 years or 8 years with him there at the helm. But the deep state, these are the same people now that behind 9/11, the same people behind the Gulf of Tonkin, the same people behind the Kennedy assassination that are behind this ongoing coup against the duly elected president right now. It's amazing to me, because you will remember that Robert Mueller, who was the special counsel for this particular ongoing coup d'etat, was the head of the FBI. Remember, it was the FBI that took all the literally 85 plus cameras from the Pentagon and the surrounding buildings and sealed them away so you can't see what really hit. And if really it was a 757, what do they have to hide, right? But that's the way it is. And a lot of these people are the same players. So I found it just was mind blowing to see it. It's like repeating itself. History is repeating itself again and again. And that's how the CIA works. They use specific recipes. They do the same thing. One, they take over the media. Let's say they're going to go into Guatemala or Honduras and overthrow or Iran, overthrow the government. They take over the media. Look at our media right now. They take over the media.
I mean, it's the leftist's biggest weapon.
So every step that they follow, and you guys can do this. I mean, there's operations that are, you can just read the Wikipedia on them and get a quick overview. Operation PB Success, Operation Gladio. Gladio was when they left actual trained terrorists. They were our people. They were Italians or some, Europeans that we had blow things up. We trained a lot of terrorists. We're still training terrorists, but that's neither here nor there. Well, I'm going to go through all these books and just kind of touch on some of the new stuff that happened. So when I meet this air traffic controller and we start working together on the Freedom of Information Act data, because he's an air traffic controller, this is radar in text. Nobody can read this stuff. I was like, okay, this is crazy. So we start going through all this stuff, and then he tells me that just north of Edwards Air Force Base is a base that the CIA uses called the Mojave Air and Spaceport, Mojave, California. And they had moved from the Tucson, Arizona area, Pinal Boneyard, to this boneyard. And it is a boneyard, but it's also SpaceX is there and some other high-tech companies, ATK and others.
Yes.
Okay. So he tells me that at this one building, International Flight School, that's where the CIA has their office. And prior to 9/11, they had an incident where a U.S. Air 757 was flying out what's called VFR, Visual Flight Rules.
Yes,
and
this I remember because I'm only a canopy pilot, which is very different, but we're both governed by the FAA as a skydiver. Although I do know, when I was speaking to a friend of mine who's a pilot, when we were talking about JFK's death, I got to learn about that for the first time. You said VFR, that's visual flight rating, right?
Visual flight rules, and you cannot fly a commercial aircraft in VFR legally. So what happened was a continental flight just south of Edwards near Barstow, California, had a near miss incident where a Continental 737 nearly hit this plane flying visual flight rules. They had to do a diversionary tactic. The Continental guy was really unhappy. He's screaming at the air traffic controllers. So this friend of mine, who became a friend of mine, started watching this plane, and it would fly then on, which is not a very long flight, from Barstow to Las Vegas, and file a flight plan to Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. And this was happening on Saturday nights for several weeks leading up to 9/11. We figured out that that was the getaway plane. Then he found out from people that worked at the boneyard that this U.S. Air 757 was fitted before 9/11 with a fuel bladder so that it could fly all the way to Europe. That every Saturday night a bus would show up, and what appeared to this young gentleman that worked at Mojave, it looked like to him flight attendants. People were carrying roller bags, little black suitcases, and they'd get on the plane. The plane would be tugged out of the tow, get on the runway, and off it would fly every Saturday, VFR rules, until it got to Vegas, file a flight plan to Washington, D.C. This air traffic controller started watching them.
Real quick,
it was an aircraft where they were practicing, and this explains how Betty Ong might have known that they were the first, because other things happened on the other flights that indicate they were told about the entire scenario. I'll go into that later. So these air traffic controllers, this guy and his buddy, they start to see something else that's an anomaly. They have a lot of shuttles can land.